This is the second video lecture about theory-based assessment. In this video lecture, we're going to be exploring cognitive behavior theory and assessments that align with that therapeutic approach. Behavior tracking is very commonly used in cognitive behavior therapy. CBT, like psychodynamic therapy, also pairs assessment as an intervention. They're quite closely aligned, as you'll come to see. Unlike psychodynamic therapy, clients are asked to self-monitor at home and bring into session for review and discussion. This is known as homework, also action planning. And you can see here that self-monitoring is both an assessment, because you're assessing what kinds of behaviors they're engaging in and you're having clients track that, and it's also an intervention in itself because you are assisting the client to develop more awareness into behaviors they engage in, for example, and it's also useful as a tool to bring into the counseling session to begin a discussion about what's been going on in the client's week and how to adjust, for example, what coping mechanisms they're using to best address those issues. There are two useful methods of self-monitoring that we're going to be exploring in this video lecture. Diary cards, which are most commonly used in dialectical behavior therapy, or DBT. We're going to look at a diary card for behavior and also one for the use of coping skills. And we're also going to look at a thought record. Thought records are most commonly used in more conventional forms of CBT, including not only the Beck model but also the Ellis model. Here's an example of a diary card from a behavioral kind of viewpoint. This is a behavioral diary card that's commonly used in things like DBT. If you look at the very top row, you see suicidal and self-injury identified as the behaviors that are being tracked. For suicidality, if you look one row below, you notice that it says urge 0 to 3, used skills 0 to 3, and then under self-injury it says urge 0 to 3, action YN, and used skills 0 to 3. Let's follow the example in the next row to understand what this all means. So the client would fill this in, and let's say they put in Sunday, and let's say they had an urge of 2 out of 3. If you look at the key at the very bottom, which is quite difficult to see, granted, but it says 2 is moderate urge. Then under used skills we have 2 out of 3, and again if you look at the used skills key, again it's small font, you can see here tried skills but couldn't do them or they didn't help. For self-injury, the urge is 1, which is a little bit, and the action was no, meaning they did not self-injure. And in terms of used skills, 0 to 3, we have 3, which is tried skills and they helped. So in other words, Sunday was a bit of a challenging day for our client in that they felt moderately suicidal, and when they tried coping skills they didn't really help them. That would be a major treatment issue to work on, and you could see here how a diary card could inform treatment. In terms of self-injury though, we should feel good that the client, while they did have a little bit of urge to self-injure, they did not self-injure, and also that they used coping skills that helped them. That's a good outcome, and we could review what's worked with the client, what coping skills they've been using effectively, how they can continue using them, and just reinforce those gains. This is a diary card for the use of coping skills, a little different than the prior diary card you looked at, which was more behavioral focused. The instructions here are to check the days you practiced each skill. This is a DBT diary card looking just at the mindfulness module, which you see on the very left hand side of the table. If you look at the rows aligned with mindfulness, so what skills are we looking at? We have having a single focus, thinking before acting, being aware of my triggers in a crisis, paying attention when people talk to me, walking meditation, not judging myself or others, observing my thoughts and feelings. On the right column you see an example. So we have example Sunday, and we have one check mark in the same row as paying attention when people talk to me, meaning that the client practiced that skill on Sunday. You then have some empty columns to the right of that example where the client would fill in the date and what coping skills they practiced each day of the week. That's useful to keep track of week to week because it helps us know not only what skills the client is practicing, but also which skills they're not practicing, which skills they could continue to practice, whether they're practicing or not just in general, and whether they can incorporate more coping skills into their life, whether they're already using 3, 4, 5 coping skills on a regular basis, or just one coping skill, for example, and whether they need more options. So it again can inform treatment. Next, we're going to learn about thought records. If you look at the table at the very top row again, you notice that we have date and time, situation, that's the situation in which the automatic thought occurred, then an automatic thought, what that was, the client would write that down, the emotions that were associated with that automatic thought, the evidence for the automatic thought and against it, the new adaptive thought that the client had, and the new emotions that they had as a result of the new adaptive thought. This is known as cognitive restructuring. There are usually questions that are asked in this thought record for the client to start self-reflecting and thinking more about each of those columns. So under situation, you have questions such as, what led to the unpleasant emotion? What distressing physical sensations did you have? That's an example of what might be going on in terms of a situation. With automatic thoughts, we have what thoughts or images went through your mind? How much did you believe the thought at the time, from 0 to 100%? For emotions, what emotions did you feel at the time? How intense was each emotion? Again, 0 to 100%. Evidence for, what is the evidence that the automatic thought is true? And is there an alternative explanation? Evidence against, what is the evidence that the automatic thought is not true? And for new adaptive thought, what's the best that could happen in this situation? And if a friend was in this situation, what would I tell him or her? That last question is particularly important because often clients will have difficulty appraising their own thoughts, but when they're able to externalize and think of someone else having that thought, then it becomes clearer to them what adaptive thought they could have. And then new emotions is the new emotions that they felt after changing how they thought about the situation. As with the diary cards we were looking at, you can tell here that thought records are useful assessment tools for understanding what automatic thoughts are coming up for the client, what emotions are tied to those, and how the strength of those emotions, what evidence is existing for and against that thought, and also what capacity the client has to think more adaptive thoughts and how helpful that adaptive thought is in terms of their emotional functioning. It's also an intervention, of course, not only an assessment tool, because a client who's completing this is going to become more aware of what they're thinking and also how they can think differently, and how that, when they change the way in which they think, it helps them to feel more adaptive emotions, healthier emotions. This is a final example of behavior tracking. This is kind of an easy example that you could use with a lot of different clients, and note how you can tailor this to the client's needs. Most of these kinds of behavior tracking can just really tailor to what issues the client has. So again, you have a weekly tracker here. On the left-hand column, you see an example which is minutes of aerobic exercise per day, and the client has tracked that for Monday, Wednesday, and Saturday, and they obviously did not complete exercise on Sunday, Tuesday, Thursday, and Friday. We may also want to track things like hours of sleep per day, and then usually when I use something like this, I'll put in client's choice. So there may be certain things that I usually like tracking. For example, hours of sleep per day is very important to me as a clinician, because if a client isn't sleeping well, it's definitely going to impact their functioning. There are maybe other things that, based on what the client's presenting problems are, we may be tracking. For example, it may be alcohol intake, number of drinks, or it might be the amount of time the client is spent thinking about or ruminating on a breakup that they had. It could be a variety of things. But again, you would tailor this and individualize this to the client. So by now you get a sense for what behavior tracking looks like and how it can be used in cognitive behavior therapy. You've seen diary cards, thought records, and a basic behavior tracking table. All of these can be used by the client, brought into session, and then used as a conversation starter to see how the client's done for that week and how what needs to be focused on in that session to help the client for the week ahead. That concludes this video lecture on cognitive behavioral theory and its application in assessment.